This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
The Gemara Megillah on Daf Hey Amud Aleph going on to Hey Amud Beis records a number of unusual practices of Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, the redactor of the Mishnah. The Gemara tells us Rabbi Nata Natiya B'Purim. Rabbi planted a tree on Purim. Many people do unusual things on Purim. Planting a tree is typically not one of them. The Gemara even questions, how is he allowed to plant a tree? Are you allowed to do malacha on Purim? And Rabbi went out of his way to do malacha, to plant a tree on Purim. Haloi davarhu. Why would he do that? The Gemara continues, V'rachatz b'kroina shel tzipori b'shavasar b'Tammuz. Rabbi purposely, publicly washed and bathed himself on a wagon in the market of Tzipori on the 17th day of Tammuz. Are you even allowed to do that? There's a question in the Rishonim whether we know Achilo Shasiya is prohibited on Shavasar B'Tammuz. What about the other Inuyim? Some say it's not permitted, and Rebbe went out of his way to specifically bathe publicly on the 17th day of Tammuz. And then finally, Rebbe's third practice, and I think a lot of us would endorse this third practice of Rebbe, Ubikesh la'akar Tisha B'Av. Rebbe wanted to uproot Tisha B'Av. And I know you're thinking he has my vote on that one. Rebbe wanted to uproot Tisha B'Av, v'loi haidulai. The rabbis did not agree with that. So the Gemara explains, Rebbe really wanted to uproot Tisha B'Av. Says the Gemara, Amar Lafana Rabbi Abba Bar Zavda, Rebbe loikacha yamaisa. That's not exactly what happened. It was a year like this year that Tisha B'Av came out on Shabbos. And Rebbe said, once we're pushing it off, let's just get rid of it entirely. And the Chachamim didn't agree, but Rebbe legitimately wanted to get rid of Tisha B'Av. And the first thing we need to ask ourselves, we don't find Rabbi Gamliel wanted to get rid of Tisha B'Av. We don't find Rabbi Akiva wanted to. Why of all Tanaim specifically did Rebbe want to abolish Tisha B'Av? We know the Navi Zechariah prophesies about the 4 Tanesim, the Tzom HaRavi, V'Tzom HaChamishi, V'Tzom HaShvi, V'Tzom HaAsiri, that the day will come that these 4 fast days will be joyous days, Yomim Tovim. It's very interesting. The Chidah points out that the prophecy of Zechariah was already alluded to in the Chumash. Because Klal Yisrael says to Aaron, okay, let's make the golden calf. So Aaron said, I'll take care of it, but not today. I'll do it tomorrow. And Aaron said, Chag Lashem Machar. Tomorrow will be a festival. What kind of festival? What kind of Yom Tif? Tomorrow will be a Yom Tif. It's going to be a great tragedy. It's going to be a fast day. So the Chidah says that Aaron was the predecessor of the prophecy of Zechariah, that the Tzom HaRavi, the fast of the 4th month, will ultimately be transformed into Sasain V'Simcha L'Mayadim Tovim. So Aaron HaKohen was saying, tomorrow, Yesh Machar La'achar Zman. Sometimes tomorrow means in the far off future. Chag L'Hashem Machar. In the future, when Mashiach comes, the 17th of Tammuz, will be a Yom Tif. This prophecy of Zechariah always troubled me because of one particular expression. Koyamar Hashem Tzivakos, Tzom HaRavi'i, V'Tzom HaChamishi, V'Tzom HaShvi, V'Tzom HaAsiri. Yeah, not Yeh LeBeis Yisrael, not Yeh LeVnei Yisrael, Yeh LeBeis Yehuda. Will be for the house of Yehuda a joyous day. Why for the house of Yehuda? It will only be a joyous day. Mashiach will only be joyous for Beis Yehuda. What about the rest of the Jewish people? What about the Aseres HaShvatim? It's not going to be a happy time for them. Why the emphasis on the Beis Yehuda? Okay, I understand that Aseres HaShvatim were exiled 100 years earlier. So the Churban was more painful for the Beis Yehuda, but why the emphasis on Beis Yehuda? Certainly when these days are transformed, it will be joyous for everybody. In Megillas Rus, Naomi tells Rus, here's the plan. You went to Boaz, you made an advance, You basically insinuated you want to marry him. He told you he's going to let you know soon, but you know how it is in dating. The guy says, I'll get right back to you, I'll get right back. In anything, anytime somebody says, I'll call you right back, that's minimum 2 weeks. Or I'll get back to you soon as 3 weeks, or I'll think about it as a month. Or I'm not really sure means never ask me again. Or I have to ask my wife is, don't you dare ask me again. So Nami tells Rus with absolute confidence that you made your advance, Shavi viti, stay here, ad asher tedon, ech yipal hadavar, ki lo yishkoid ho'ish, ki im kila hadavar hayom, Boaz will let you know today, as they say in Yiddish, adar ya, adar nish, either yes or no, whether he's going to marry you. He's not going to play any games with you. He's not going to hem and haw. He will let you know today, yes or no. What, Nami was a Neviah? How did Nami know Boaz would give an answer today? There are all kinds of complications in this relationship. Can he marry her? She's from Moav. I know every time I speak here it's about, Moav. But I like the topic. Who says he could marry her? There's a closer relative. What about Ploni Almoni? What about Toiv? Maybe he's going to want to marry her. How could Rus be told by Nami definitively, Boaz will seal the deal Hayom today? The Medrash tells us something very interesting about Tisha B'Av. These are the words of the Medrash, whatever it means. But the Medrash says, black and white, that there's a momentous, monumental event that transpires on Tisha B'Av, the birth of a renowned personage, maybe the most important person who will ever be. The Medrash says, an individual, Menachem, the constellation, Mashiach, Boy Bayoim Noilad. Mashiach is born on Tisha B'Av. Bamidbar Rabbah, Parsha Yud Gimel, Oisei. Quite a day for Mashiach to be born. I mean, he couldn't have come up with a better day. How did he pick that day? How did he come up with that one? Couldn't pick a better day to be born than Tisha B'Av? Why would Mashiach be born on Tisha B'Av? What's the hashgacha of that? What's the significance of that? Why does God orchestrate it that way? The Gemara tells us in Baba Basra that the positioning of the Kruvim would reflect the relationship that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has with Klal Yisrael. The Gemara asks a stira between various psukim and the Nevi'im. Are the Kruvim facing each other? Are the Kruvim back to back? So the Gemara says it depends really on how we behave. Bizman sha'oisin ritzoyno shel makom, when the Klal Yisrael accords himself in the proper way, then the Kruvim are facing each other and they're ishalachiv, directly gazing at each other in friendship, in love. And the Gemara says, "Bizman she'ein oisin ritzono shel makom." They're basically like a couple at war. Their backs are to each other. They can't even look at each other. Says the Gemara, the positioning of the Kruvim reflect the relationship between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Knesset Yisrael. So naturally, you would expect that when the Umay Sa'olam entered the Heichal and they went into the Holy of Holies and they pulled the veil of the Paroiches and they saw the Kruvim, we would have expected the Kruvim to have been back to back. And yet the Gemara in Yuma says from a pasuk in Malachim, not only were the Kruvim not back to back, not only were the Kruvim facing each other, they were embracing each other, intertwined like a man and his beloved. At such a time, clearly we had committed Averos, Sinas Chinam, many other Chatam. If you look through Chazal, Loi Charva Yerushalayim Ella, Loi Charva Yerushalayim Ella, a whole list, a whole litany of Averos that Klal Yisrael committed. I don't think we could have identified a time that Klal Yisrael were in Ein Oisin Ritzono Shel Makom more than at the time of the Churban. Why were the Kruvim embracing each other at the time of the Churban Beis HaMikdash? So the Bnei Yissaschar, Rav Tzvi Elimelech of Dinov, quotes one of the early Hasidic masters, Rav Pinchas of Karetz, that conceptually, for the conception of a soul, the status of Mashiach, to produce such a lofty, elevated, holy soul, you needed a very intense, passionate union. Now there's an interesting human phenomenon that you could have a couple or a family and you could visit them and you don't necessarily see tangibly the love and the emotion that one feels for the other. But you know when the love is really aroused and awakened and engendered? When they have to part from each other. You go to the airport and spouses, families are hugging, kissing, embracing, crying. As they say, absence makes the heart grow fond. So they could have been together for 40 years and we never saw this level of intensity of emotion. But when they have to separate, that's really what arouses and awakens the emotion between two people who love each other. Says Pinchas of Karetz, certainly Klal Yisrael at the time of the Churban were ein oisin ritzayna shel makom. But haloihu avicha kanecha, God's our Father. We're banim atem l'Hashem Elokeichem. We're His beloved children. So He loves us, ben kach uben kach. And at that moment, when God would have to separate from us, where the Rebbe was parting from us in a way where it was like the relationship was being severed, it aroused, it awakened such an intensity, such a passion of love that there was a connection and a ahava that was nisoirer at the moment of the churban, shaloi haya kamayu me'olam. That there was never such a zivug, so to speak. There was never such an intensity of emotion, of love, of longing, of gaguim, than when the Rebbe Shalom had to withdraw and let the Gentiles destroy the temple. It was at that moment of zivug, Chazal tell us, that a husband has certain marital obligations to his spouse, especially chayiv adam lifgoid es ishtay b'shashu yotzei ladarach. When a husband goes on a trip and he leaves his spouse, he has a specific obligation, marital obligation, because she longs for him at that time. So because God was withdrawing to an extent, and we longed for Him, and we needed Him, He responded with a arousal of love to Klal Yisrael. That is what produced the soul of Mashiach being born on Tisha B'Av, says the Bnei Yissaschar in the name of Rabbi Pinchas of Karetz. So it's very interesting. Tisha B'Av is the most tragic day of the year, but there's something beneath the surface that the withdrawal arouses. It produces and engenders a certain love of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Klal Yisrael that's incomparable any other time of the year. But if we study some of the other fast days, we will discover that this similar phenomenon exists on some of the other fast days. Chasam Sofer quotes the Targum that Rus showed up at the field of Boaz Erev Pesach. If you want to bother someone, Erev Pesach is always the best time. Rus has nothing to eat. Imagine, she shows up Erev Pesach. And she stays there. Ad kalois katsir chitim ukatsir sa'orim, which is 3 months. Which concludes on the 15th day of Tammuz, says the Chasam Sofer. Nami tells Rus, okay, now make your move. Go to the threshing floor tonight, the 16th. Lay by his feet, midnight at the threshing floor, and insinuate what you want. And that's what she does. And Boaz says, Shechvi ad haboiker, stay till the morning. In the morning, Boaz says, get out of here before anybody comes. But I'll let you know what I'm going to do. And she returns to Nami. And Nami says, Shavi biti, stay my daughter. Ara sher teiden echibo davar, ki loy yishgoid ha'ish ki im kila hadavar hayoim. the man will tell you what to do today. This is the 16th of Tammuz. Says Chasam Sofer, how was Naomi confident that Boaz would make his decision today? That's because that evening begins Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. And Shiva Asar B'Tammuz is Reya Mazle Lebeis Yehuda. It's a very dark time for the house of Yehuda. That's the time of the Churban Bayis, especially for the Malchus Beis Dovid. Not so much for the Aseres HaShvatim. They were exiled at a completely different occasion. But for the Beis Yehuda, the 3 weeks is a very tragic time. He's not going to want to marry you tomorrow. After all, Minhag Yisrael is we don't get married during the 3 weeks, and there's a reason for that. Because it's Reya Mazle Lebeis Yehuda. I am confident that if the man will marry you, it will be today. And sure enough, Chasam Sofer says, he proposed to her that day before the onset of the Shloisha Shavuos, the onset of the 3 weeks. And that night, the night of Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, Boaz consummated the marriage. And by the morning he was dead. But Rus had conceived. Dovid, the progenitor of Malchus Beis Dovid, like the Mashiach that's born on Tisha B'Av, Dovid was conceived on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. How interesting. So on the surface, it's Reya Mazle. But when you dig a little bit beneath the surface, there's a certain latent potential of redemptive quality during this time of the year. And I happen to discover in the writings of Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, who says if Mashiach is born on Tisha B'Av, it was probably a quick job, which means it was a Leida Lemekutayim, which means that it was a 7-month job, which means that his mother conceived Mashiach 7 months earlier from the 9th of Av, which is the 10th of Teves, Asar B'Teves. So, from 3 different places, we discover that the tragic days of the year, Tisha B'Av, Asar B'Teves, Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, on the surface they seem tragic, and they are. But when you dig a little deeper, you know, there's an idea that all Kedusha is covered with a klipa, a shell, whatever that means exactly. The Ois Bris Kodesh, the Bris Milah, is coated with an arla. When the Jewish people entered the land of Israel, it was protected, it was coated by the 31 kings, by Hamelech. There's always a coating over Kedusha that you need to peel away, but in the center of it is a certain latent Kedusha and redemptive quality that you could access. Bnei Yissaschar points out that throughout Shas, Rabbi is always looking to defend David Hamelech. The Gemara has a discussion. Did David sin? Did David not sin? The Gemara says, Kol Omer David chata eino elataya. Anyone who criticizes David is making a big mistake. Kol Omer Shloimeh chata eino elataya. Who's coming to the advocacy of David? Rabbi. Not Rabbi Akiva and not Rabbi Tarfain. Why Rabbi? What does Rabbi have with David? Says the Gemara, Amar Rav, Rabbi demi beis David ka'asi. Rabbi came from David Hamelech. He was a scion of Davidic dynasty. So Rabbi is always coming to defend King David. So Rabbi is the one who says, Kol Omer David chata eino elataya. So Rabbi's part of the family. He's part of the Davidic family. There's an interesting Yerushalmi, I believe it's quoted in Yardei in the Mechaber. Yerushalmi says that if someone passes away in the family, Yidagu kol hamishpacha, everyone in the family should be concerned. The mashal the Yerushalmi gives is to a pile of rocks, a pile of stones, and one of them is removed, the whole pile becomes wobbly, becomes unstable. But says the Yerushalmi, Noilad ben Zachar nisrapa kol hamishpacha. When a baby boy is born, the whole family is cured. Last night I went to pay a Shiva call Somebody who's sitting Shiva had a baby boy during the Shiva, Shalom Zachar during the Shiva. It's a great Nechama. Noilad ben Zachar Nisrapa Khan Mishpacha. Says the Bnei Yissaschar, Rebbe came from David's family. When Tisha B'Av comes, Rebbe is margish. He has a certain spiritual sensation. Mashiach is born today. His family is cured. Let's get rid of Tisha B'Av. Nobody else senses it. Nobody else connects with it to the level of Rebbe, because Rebbe's part of the family. Rebbe mi beis Dovid ka'asi. Perhaps we could suggest that's why Rebbe planted a tree on Purim. Because the Gemara later down on the page asks, what kind of tree is Rebbe planting? The Gemara says, Avarnaki Shamalachem, a tree of kings. Why is Rebbe planting a tree of kings? You know, as much as everyone loves Purim, I think that there's somebody who's a little bit uncomfortable on Purim. You know, there's an interesting observation. I think I once saw it in Rav Shechter's Sefer Eretz Tzvi from the Tosfos Rid in Sukkah, that all the brachos in Shemona Esrei have a piyut, a kroivitz on Purim, except for as Tzemach David. So the Rishonim say, because we Shalayim and as a Tzemach David is really one bracha. It was originally one bracha. But Rav Pinchas of Karet says, the reason why there's no kroivitz for Purim, for as Tzemach David, is because David doesn't really love Purim. Because Purim is the day of Shaul, of Shevet Binyamin, that Shaul, King Shaul, was redeemed. He was taken off the hook for not killing Hamelech. And when Shaul is redeemed, David is not that comfortable on that day. Some say the reason why we don't say Hallel on Purim, even though the Gemara doesn't say this, is because Hallel was David's praise for Hashem when he became Melech. But Purim is the day of Shaul. So David doesn't celebrate Purim. So Rebbe's getting a little nervous on Purim. Shaul is having his day, as we know. Mordechai tells Esther, Adu beis avich toivedu. You're going to go down if you don't eradicate Haman. So okay, we bailed Shaul out. But David says, leave me out of this day. Don't give me any kroivitz on Purim. So Rebbe, who comes from the house of Rebbe who comes from the house of David, he plants a tree of melachim, meaning, you want to celebrate Purim? Fine. But don't forget who sovereignty belongs to. That belongs to our family. That belongs to the Davidic dynasty. So that's the second practice of Rebbe related to establishing Malchus. And it's suggested, Rebbe rachatz bekroina shel tzipoiri beshiva asar b'Tammuz. What does rachatz mean? Literally bathed. But it could be interpreted homiletically, as we say in Bruch Shemei, Bei anor rachitz, in him I trust. Rebbe rachatz, Rebbe trusted. Bekroina, in the glory, shel tzipoiri. The Zohar says that Tzipar always refers to Mashiach. Rebbe had faith in the ultimate redemption, Beshiva Asar B'Tammuz. It's interesting. The parsha that we read preceding Shiva Asar B'Tammuz is Parshas Balak. And Balak, he's Vayoshes El Hamidbar Panav. He's looking, the Targum says, he's always focused on the Chet HaEgel. Because of course the Chet HaEgel happened on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. So naturally we're going to read about Parshas Balak in the days before Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. Balak's trying to capitalize on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. But Balak is like the klipa. He's like the outer shell. Because dormant in Balak, Ben Sipar, a reference to Mashiach, is the Malchus Beis David that lays dormant in Balak. The Maharal writes, Kairach has a kuf in the beginning. He started off with Kedusha. He started off as a good guy. He soured. Chukas has a kuf in the middle. You have a guy, he's a good guy, he's tahar. He became tameh. We sprinkle the ashes of the paraduma, so Kedusha is in the middle, the Maharal says. But that guy who becomes tar, he renders tameh the person who sprinkled on him. So in Chukas, the kuf's in the middle. In Balak, he's not really a great guy. The kuf's is all in the end. Because ultimately the Gemara says in the Zechus that Balak brought 42 karbanos, Zacha v'yatz mimena malchus beis David. So Balak is the outer shell, he's the arla, he's the klipa. But Rebbe's part of the family. And Rebbe wants to abolish Tisha B'Av because that's the day of the birth of Mashiach. And Rebbe senses that on Purim he has to establish the monarchy for the Malchus Beis David. The Rebbe rachatz bekroina shel tzipori b'shiva asar b'Tammuz. Rebbe had faith that on the 17th day of Tammuz, even though right now it's a tragic day, he had faith in the prophecy of Zechariah, Tzoim haravi, v'tzoim hachamishi, v'tzoim hashvi, v'tzoim ha'asiri. Yes, will be for all the Jewish people, but yeh lebeis Yehuda. More than anyone else, the Beis Yehuda sense the redemptive quality of the Malchus Beis David in this time of the year, more even than the rest of the Jewish people. May we all be zoichet to see very soon the fruition of this nevuah. Yeh lebeis Yehuda l'sasan u'lesimcha u'l'mayadim toivim v'ha'emes v'ha'shalom ehavu b'bias kol tzedek meher v'yaminu. Amen.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.